Dalton Keene once thought his life had hit rock bottom. Just 3 months earlier, he had a ranch, a family, and plans he had not yet carried out. Now, all of it had disappeared into debt and the mysterious death of his older brother. The remote cabin deep in the pine forest was the last thing Dalton could buy with all the money he had left to gamble for a chance to start over. That morning, as the wagon slowly climbed the winding trail, Dalton believed he was leaving the past behind. No neighbors, no town, no painful memories. Only trees, the morning wind, and silence. But then, he saw a thin line of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. Dalton's heart sank. Someone was there, inside the house that belonged to him. In that moment, the fragile hope he had carried through the long journey began to crack. Dalton stopped the wagon and tightened the reins. He had lost too much to keep backing down. Stepping onto the ground, Dalton adjusted his hat and took a deep breath. If someone thought they could take the last thing he had left, they had chosen the wrong man. Dalton Keene did not come here to give up. He came to take his life back, even if that meant facing trouble from the very first moment. Dalton pushed open the old wooden door and stepped into the cabin, ready for a confrontation. But the scene in front of him made him pause. The room was neat and warmer than he had expected. A vase of freshly picked wildflowers sat on the table. The fire in the fireplace was still burning, and the smell of newly baked bread lingered in the air. This was not a temporary shelter for a drifter. Then he saw her. A young woman stood near the fireplace, her reddish-brown hair catching the morning light. She turned around, her blue eyes widening for a brief moment before she quickly regained her composure. Her beauty was not flashy, but there was something strong in the way she stood upright, even though she was clearly at a disadvantage. She introduced herself as Cora Lane. Her voice was steady, no begging, no fear. When Dalton made it clear that he was the new owner and asked her to leave, Cora simply looked straight at him and said one short sentence, "I can't leave this place." Those words sent a chill down Dalton's spine. This was not an excuse from a squatter, but the certainty of someone pushed into a corner. Dalton looked more closely. Her clothes were clean, the cabin carefully maintained. Cora was not here to avoid responsibility, but to hide. Dalton began to understand. The woman in front of him was keeping a secret, and this cabin was more than a shelter. It was the final line between her and a danger lurking somewhere outside. The conversation between Dalton and Cora had barely gone anywhere when a strange sound came from outside. At first, it was only a vague noise echoing through the pine forest, but it quickly became clear, rapid, urgent hoofbeats, nothing like the sound of travelers passing by chance. Cora froze. The color drained from her face in an instant. She hurried to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain, moving like someone far too familiar with being hunted. Dalton followed, his heart pounding when he saw 3 riders advancing along the narrow trail that led straight to the cabin. They rode confidently, spread out in formation, clearly knowing exactly where they were going. Cora turned to Dalton, her voice trembling slightly. She asked if anyone knew he would be coming here today. When Dalton answered that he had kept the purchase of the cabin secret, a flash of despair crossed Cora's eyes. She whispered that she had hoped those men would never find this place. In that moment, Dalton realized something terrifying. His presence was not the cause of the danger. He had only stepped into it by accident. The men approaching were not coming for the cabin, but for Cora, and her last place of refuge had just been discovered. The sound of hooves stopped right in front of the porch. The cabin sank into a heavy silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The cabin door burst open without a knock. 3 men stepped inside, carrying the smell of road dust and open menace. The one in front was tall, with a thick black beard and the cold, confident eyes of a man used to giving orders. He scanned the room, then stopped when his gaze landed on Cora standing behind Dalton. A faint smile appeared on his lips. "There you are," he said in a deep, firm voice. "You made us work hard to find you. No phrase." He introduced himself as Marcus Webb and coldly declared that Cora was his wife. According to him, she was nothing more than a stubborn woman who needed to be taken back to where she belonged. Cora trembled, but she still stepped forward, stating clearly that the marriage had been forced on her. Her words were not weak. They carried the bitterness of anger held back for far too long. Dalton stepped forward, placing himself in front of Cora. He declared that this was his legal property and that no one had the right to barge in like this. Marcus looked Dalton up and down with open contempt, as if weighing the worth of a minor obstacle. To Marcus, the law was something he could bend at will. To Dalton, this was no longer a dispute over land. It was the moment he realized that if he stepped aside, he would become an accomplice to cruelty. And for the first time since losing everything, Dalton chose to stand his ground not just for the cabin, but for the woman trembling behind him. No longer patient enough to argue, Marcus Webb gave a cold signal to his men. With a single nod, he turned words into action. One of the men moved toward the fireplace and grabbed a burning log. The flames flared up, reflected in Dalton's eyes like a sentence being passed. "Burn it," Marcus said, his voice disturbingly calm, as if the cabin were nothing more than a pile of lifeless wood. To him, destruction was the fastest way to force others to submit. Dalton was stunned. This house was everything he had left: his money, his hope, his chance to rebuild his life. If it turned to ashes, he would have nothing left to lose. He stepped forward, his hand instinctively sliding toward the gun at his side. But the 3 gun barrels aimed at him made the air feel thick and heavy. Behind Dalton, Cora broke down in tears. She grabbed his sleeve and begged him to stop. She said she was willing to go back with Marcus, just so Dalton would not have to pay the price for her. But when Dalton turned around, he suddenly noticed her hand pressed tightly against her stomach. The loose dress could no longer hide the truth. Cora was pregnant. In that moment, everything changed. This was no longer about a house under threat. This was about a mother trying to protect her unborn child from a man who saw people as property. Dalton understood that if he backed down now, he would lose more than the cabin. He would lose his own conscience. Realizing he could not force Dalton with words or fire, Marcus Webb switched to another game more dangerous and more cruel. He raised his hand to signal his men to stop, then turned to Dalton with a calculating smile. "A duel, 1 bullet, 1 outcome." Marcus explained the rules slowly, clearly, and chillingly. If Dalton won, Cora would be free, and Marcus would leave forever. If Dalton lost, he would die on the very land he had just bought, and Cora would be taken back in invisible chains. There was no way out, no rules other than speed and survival. Cora rushed forward in panic, begging Dalton not to accept. She told him he owed her nothing, that he did not need to sacrifice everything for a stranger. But Dalton saw in her eyes not only fear, but a fierce determination to protect her unborn child. And he understood that there are moments in life when silence itself becomes a crime. Dalton nodded, not because he believed he would win, but because he knew that if he refused, he would spend the rest of his life asking himself, "What if I had done the right thing?" And what about you? If you were in Dalton's place, standing alone against a brutal man to save a stranger, would you accept the gunfight, or would you turn your back and walk away? Leave a comment below. I would really like to know your choice. Just before stepping out onto the porch, Cora grabbed Dalton's arm. Her hand was trembling, but her eyes were strangely firm. She knew that if she did not speak the truth now, there might never be another chance. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, yet every word felt as heavy as a stone pressing on Dalton's chest. Marcus Webb was not just the man hunting her. He was the one who had killed Dalton's brother. Cora said she had once heard Marcus brag while drunk about a stubborn ranch owner who refused to sell his water rights and was shot dead on a lonely trail. Marcus had even kept the victim's watch as a trophy, with 2 initials clearly engraved inside. Dalton went numb. Every detail matched perfectly with the mysterious death of his brother 6 months earlier. In that moment, all the losses in Dalton's life fell into place like pieces of a complete picture. The ranch being seized, his future collapsing, and the desperate journey to this cabin, all of it traced back to one man. Anger rose inside him, but it was not blind. It was cold, deep, and sharp like a blade. The coming duel was no longer a reckless act for a stranger. It had become an unavoidable confrontation between the man who caused the tragedy and the man who had to live with its consequences. Dalton tightened his grip on the gun at his side. Now, he was not only protecting Cora and her unborn child, he was stepping outside to demand justice for his brother, who had died in silence. The yard in front of the cabin sank into a heavy silence. Dalton and Marcus stood facing each other, separated by several dozen steps, the harsh sunlight beating down on the dry ground. Two men, two fates, and only one of them would leave this place alive. Marcus began to count. His voice was calm and confident, as if the outcome were already decided. Dalton listened to his own heartbeat, slow and strangely steady. In that brief moment, he did not think about death. He thought of his brother who had fallen, of Cora and the child hiding behind the thin wooden door. The counting ended. Two hands moved at the same time. A gunshot rang out, tearing through the quiet air. Marcus was fast, but Dalton was faster by a single breath. Marcus Webb collapsed to the ground, his gun still half raised in his hand. The dust slowly settled, revealing a motionless body. But it was not over. The two men with Marcus immediately drew their guns and aimed straight at Dalton. His gun was empty. Death seemed only a trigger pull away. At that moment, another shot exploded from the direction of the cabin. One man dropped, crying out in pain. Cora appeared in the doorway, holding an old hunting rifle, her eyes completely steady. The balance had shifted. In that life-or-death moment, no one was the hunted anymore. The sound of hoofbeats echoed again, but this time it carried no threat. A group of lawmen appeared in front of the cabin, led by the familiar sheriff of the area. Before them lay the body of Marcus Webb, one injured man, and Cora standing silently with a gun still smoking in her hands. For a brief moment, all eyes turned to Dalton, the man who had just shot someone considered respectable. But Cora stepped forward. Her voice did not shake, and she did not avoid their gaze. She told them everything: the forced marriage to pay off debts, the threats, the violence, and her escape to protect her unborn child. Dalton handed over his brother's old watch. Inside were the familiar engraved initials and a small folded piece of paper, a map leading to where the evidence was hidden. When the sheriff saw the watch, his expression changed. He remembered its former owner, a man whose death had never been properly explained. The truth slowly came into the light. Testimonies, documents, and evidence came together, forming a clear picture of Marcus's crimes: coercion, murder, and the seizure of property. The lies he had built collapsed right on the land he once ruled with confidence. Cora was no longer a fugitive. Dalton was no longer a troublemaker. They stood there among the ruins, as justice finally found its way back. 6 months had passed since that fateful day. The old cabin had been rebuilt, stronger than before, standing peacefully amid the deep green pine forest. In the morning, soft sunlight fell across the porch, where Dalton stood quietly watching Cora hang out the laundry. Her belly was now large, her steps slow but full of calm, a kind of peace she had never known before. Justice had finally been served. The forced marriage was annulled, Marcus's property was seized, and Cora no longer had to live in fear. Dalton, too, found the truth behind his brother's death, closing a painful chapter of his life. Dalton had come to this place thinking he was running away from the past, carrying only loss and loneliness. But fate led him down a different path. He not only found the truth, he found a reason to keep living, and a reason to protect. Cora placed a hand on her belly and smiled as she felt the baby's first kick. She said that if it was a boy, she would name him Samuel to honor the man who had opened the path to justice for them. Dalton nodded. He knew his brother would be at peace. Sometimes, what we believe to be a desperate choice becomes the most precious gift. And sometimes, a cabin in the forest is not the end of the road, but the place where life truly begins.